people often now think of Gaza as connected to Islamist politics, to having
Mm.
some particular proclivity for Islamist politics and Hamas. Um, Talk about the evolution of politics in Gaza. What were the dominant political factions, Palestinian factions in Gaza in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, and how is it that ultimately Islamist politics becomes more central?
Mm. Yeah. So the first thing that's really important to understand is that Gaza has has always been the site of really active Palestinian political conversations ever since the Nakba, and also that there's been quite a lot of political diversity. So one thing I talk about in the book is that in the 1950s and the 1960s, we really see quite a range of political ideologies. What runs through all of them is a commitment to the Palestinian national cause, but that takes different forms. So, there are quite active communists, Palestinian communists and socialists and leftists in Gaza in the 1950s and 1960s. This is a period where you see leftist politics actually, kind of in the ascendant across a lot of the Arab world. Gaza's no exception there. You also see the more kind of secular nationalism that's really characterized by Fatah. So Fatah is formally created in Kuwait in the late 1950s, but the three men in particular who are critical to its founding, obviously led by Yasser Arafat, they actually really make their initial connections to one another in Gaza. And they're all involved in this early organization of Fedayeen or militants who are doing these armistice line crossings and these early raids. So Gaza is really an important crucible for Fatah, and Fatah is essentially, I mean, it's quite ideologically, in some ways, some critics would call it ideologically empty, but it's really dedicated to the cause of Palestinian nationalism and not much else. It doesn't really get involved in bigger, sweeping ideological conversations. Arguably, that's one of its strengths because it gives it that broader appeal and it avoids restricting it too much. In the 50s, 60s, and 70s, Islamist politics in Gaza, and to be honest, in Palestine in general, is much less political or much less politically active than we would probably assume from today's vantage point. So I talk about this quite a lot in the book, that the Muslim Brotherhood has always been significant in Gaza, not least because of its proximity to Egypt, which is obviously the home of the Muslim Brotherhood. But in the decades after the Nakba, their approach is quite quietist. They focus on what they call Islamization of society. They focus on social services, welfare services, building mosques. Their argument is that what they need to do is Islamize society and that, political liberation will follow from that. It's only really in the 80s that the Islamist movement in its current militant political form starts to take off in Gaza, and there's various reasons for that we can go into, but it would certainly not be accurate to see Gaza's post-Nakba history as being consistently driven by Islamist politics, or to see Palestinian politics in Gaza as being consistently Islamist, because that's certainly not the case.
So jumping all the way forward to the present,
Okay.
um, when you think about where Gaza is now in this long sweep, Israel has most of Gaza is destroyed. Israel has kind of cut Gaza in half,
Yeah.
where it doesn't seem like the part under Israeli occupation is likely to have many Palestinians living in it.
Yeah.
Um, so how do you see the last 2 years and now the immediate aftermath of the 2 years of destruction and
Mhm.
fragmentation? How does it connect to this longer story that you're telling?
Yeah, I think there's a few things to flag. I mean, many Palestinians and other commentators have made this point that the post 23 genocide is not an aberration, but rather a culmination, and that we're not seeing necessarily new dynamics. We're just seeing a kind of escalation or intensification of longer term dynamics. Something that's really struck me, particularly actually in recent weeks and months, is the ways in which, in some way, to some level, we're almost seeing a replaying of the original Nakba.
Mhm.
Because if you think about the original Nakba of 48, it was the mass expulsion and confinement of the Palestinians from the whole of the country into what became the Gaza Strip. So it was sort of pushing people into the southwestern corner of Palestine. And over the last 2 years, the Israeli army has kind of done that again within the Gaza Strip. It's pushed the population further and further southern and further inward, westways towards the coast. As you said, it's now essentially split Gaza in half, with the Israeli army still directly occupying and controlling at least 58% of the strip, and as you said, very few Palestinians in that 58%. I know you had Mohammed on the show a few weeks ago, and he talked a lot about how the only Palestinians who are really allowed there are these small militias and clans who are working with the Israeli army. But one way you could see these dynamics is essentially a continuation of this long-term project of expulsion and kind of shrinkage of the territory in which Palestinians are allowed to exist. If you remember, over the summer, Israel floated this plan to have what they called a humanitarian city in Rafah, where they would eventually confine all the Palestinians of Gaza, and from where they would only be allowed to leave in order to resettle permanently outside of Palestine and give up their right to return. I think that was another element of this long-term dynamic of essentially you're trying to ultimately push and expel people out of the country, and you are gradually doing it by diminishing the territory in which they have access to and in which they're allowed to exist.
Yeah. I guess my last question is, obviously people in Gaza are part of the Palestinian people, but I wonder if you, and this is if you had to make, if you had to point to what you think is distinct about the politics and politics and culture in Gaza as distinct from Palestinian politics and culture more generally, what would you highlight?
Are you talking now or
Now? Yes.
now? Yeah. I mean,
Well,
now,
yes. Although if there are enduring strands as
yeah,
well, that's
yeah. I mean, I think one thing that is enduring is that, as I've said, you have a real lasting legacy of the Nakba in Gaza in a way that's quite intensive, because it is the majority of the population, and because Gaza, as a result of the Nakba, the Gaza Strip almost becomes a microcosm of Palestine, because you have people from across Palestine. I mean, some areas are obviously much more heavily represented than others, but it does take on this status, and it also becomes disproportionately, or it has this outside significance within the movement for return as well. I think even prior to the genocide, we saw that with the Great March of Return. I don't think it was a coincidence that it was Palestinians in Gaza who were speaking in terms of return. There have been similar movements in the diaspora and elsewhere, so I don't want to over exceptionalize Gaza, but it was a very deliberate assertion of that history. And I think the March of Return was also an effort by Palestinians in Gaza to push against narratives that were placing the violence as beginning with the rise of Hamas. I think it was in some ways a rejection of that narrative that Israel had really been pushing, that this was a problem since 2006 or 2007, and that they were trying to actually resituate it even beyond 1967, which is the other sort of false starting point we often hear, and take it right all the way back to 1948, and to make that point about the origins of the situation and the violence today. I think the other really crucial distinctive factor about Gaza, I mean, certainly in comparison to the West Bank, is that although we've seen in both territories, Israel has been increasingly immobilizing and isolating Palestinians in recent decades, that's been much more pronounced in Gaza. And again, that predated the rise of Hamas. So, Israel started isolating Gaza in the early 1990s. It started building its first fence around Gaza in the 1990s and introducing a new permit regime that made it difficult for Palestinians from Gaza to leave or to cross the Green Line from the 1990s. So that isolation, combined with the very dense population density, which is itself a product of the Nakba, is also quite distinctive to Gaza, certainly compared to the West Bank. And since the final thing I'd add,
yeah,
sorry,
please,
is that since
please.
2005, when you had the unilateral disengagement and evacuation of around 8,000 settlers from Gaza, it's also taken on this particular status whereby, because Israel has made it into a confined, isolated space only for Palestinians, that has also given Israel freedom way before 2023 to pursue quite brutal and nihilistic wars there in a way that would never have been possible if settlers were still there, and in a way that wouldn't be possible en masse in the West Bank for the same reason. There's no way that the genocide of the last 2 years would have happened in the way it had if there were still settlers in Gaza.